The earliest films were simply one static shot that showed an event or location, unedited, without cuts, until Georges Méliès started to play some tricks in his films in 1898. Early filmmakers used mattes and double exposures to achieve the effect of film compositing, and some of these pre-digital effects are still in use today. Compositing is the combining of visual elements from separate sources into single images, often to create the illusion that these elements are part of the same scene. With the development of technology, digital editing on computers replaced scissors and glue. Today, most, though not all, compositing is achieved through digital image manipulation. Green screen and CGI have become most common in the post-production industry. In recent years, the proportion of visual effects is rapidly increasing in the film industry, and people have become more critical of visual effects. There is no doubt that an audience will not believe images that still have a chroma key edge or corrupted regions where the chroma key does not work. It's now necessary to get a realistic chroma key. But how can filmmakers convince the audience? How do you achieve a high-quality green screen shot that seems real?
I think green screening and chroma keying is a fine art in itself. To get good results, you need the best equipment that you can get your hands on. I've done chroma keying when HD cameras were first introduced, and you think, wow, that's such great quality. But obviously now you get up to 4K, and if you can film with 4K for chroma keying, then so much the better. The results are astoundingly better than they used to be. And then obviously whatever system you use to actually do the post-production makes a big difference as well. So yeah, it's improving all the time. Lighting obviously is integral to the whole setup. It makes a big difference. Somebody knows what they're doing with light. But it's a great method of working.
Yeah, I think a lot about getting good green screen is to do with lighting and getting the natural lighting that you'd expect in a scene. So if it was going to be outdoors but rainy, you've got to try and, within the studio, try and match those kind of conditions. So obviously you've got to have it kind of well lit, but you've also got to think, okay, you know, if it's going to be grey and rainy, it'd be a little bit duller, so you wouldn't have really bright lights. So it's knowing the end shot that you want to kind of create, and the lighting conditions that end shot would have if it was shot for real, and then trying to recreate those elements within the green screen studio. So the technical side of things is a lot easier. There are a lot more sophisticated plugins that deal with taking the green screen out and taking the spill of the green that are on the actors, taking that away. So yeah, I think that's the main kind of key. There's technical aspects of making sure that the actor isn't too close to the background, that there's shadows on the background wall. But I think a lot of it, and especially for convincing an audience, is getting the lighting conditions the same as the shot that you're going to composite into.
Photoreal means to create a shot that looks as real or true to life as possible. It can mean that the visual effect is so totally convincing that the audience doesn't see it because of the photorealism of the shot and its finely detailed imaging. Another term for this is invisible effects. But compared with fantasy shots, are photorealistic shots more difficult to achieve? Are realistic video effects shots a lot more specialist to achieve and create than fantasy shots?
I think it's inevitable that realistic shots are more difficult to achieve than fantasy shots. Obviously you've got to convince the audience that you're creating a reality, and so yes, it takes a lot of work to be able to do that. Fantasy shots are generally much easier, but I personally like doing more fantasy shots because you can really play with colour and with whatever effects you are. You can take things more into a kind of an abstract realm, which I personally enjoy doing. But if it's purely about which is the most difficult to achieve, then it has to be the more realistic shot.
I think when you introduce realism into an effect shot, because we're surrounded daily by realism, it's a lot harder to convince an audience that this, what you're then watching, is real. So again, elements like correct lighting, shadows, reflections, and the overall grading of an image has to be a lot more kind of considered and more time spent on that to convince an audience that this is real. Whereas if you're in an animated world or a fantasy world where the sky might be red or the grass is blue, your audience is already making compensations for that. So it's a lot easier to kind of create those kind of fantasy worlds. Everybody knows what somebody walking down the street looks like, or a car looks like, or reflections on a window look like in the real world. Nobody particularly knows what they look like in a fantasy world. So yeah, it's a lot harder to kind of convince people.
Nowadays, in some films, audiences never know which shots are faked unless they see the video effects breakdown. Some people think that once the effects are invisible, they are pointless.
I mean, obviously, there's other films where it goes beyond convincing and goes into the realms of fantasy. But if you're working to play with the audience sense of what's real and what's not, then obviously, if they can't see your visual effects, then you've achieved your goal. I saw Birdman recently, and the visual effects in there are just fantastic, and how they do the editing and the camera work. And you know, a lot of it is invisible. You need to kind of look at the post-production work to see exactly the amount of work that's been carried out, but you can still appreciate the artistry and the film and the narrative without knowing all those things.
I think effects have always strived to be invisible. You know, it's been said, you know, from the 1960s or 70s or even before, that they know, effects people know when they've got something right is when nobody notices. It doesn't stand out glaringly obvious. Now, things have got more sophisticated recently, so it's slightly easier to make things more invisible. But I think the industry has always strived to be as invisible as possible, really. And I think it's a balance, because you want recognition for the fantastic work that you've done, but at the same time you don't want it to be noticed. So I think, you know, there's some points now, even as an insider, that I kind of going, is that faked? Is it real? And a lot of the times, you know, I get fooled, which is a nice thing to kind of look back later and kind of go, oh, okay, actually that wasn't real. But I think the industry has always strived, visual effects has always strived to be invisible right from the early days. Really, there's just better tools to do it nowadays.
Filmmakers often use CGI to achieve impossible images. For example, when Forrest Gump shakes hands with Kennedy. But some people still insist on shooting the scene for real, even though it could be solved in post-production. For example, Christopher Nolan planted a 500-acre cornfield for Interstellar, when he could have achieved all of this in CGI, and some people wonder if it would have been easier.
I mean, there's certain parts to the film that would be very, very difficult to achieve purely through CGI. I mean, when he's driving through all those fields, it would be, I mean, it's possible, but kind of, it would seem kind of pointless. So I think he did the right choice, certainly, for a lot of those shots. But I think he's obviously got an understanding of the balance of what you need to do to achieve a film in its entirety. So there's so much visual effects, compositing, and everything else in there, and pure visual computer graphics. So I think to plant that field for those certain shots was a wise choice, and I think worked perfectly. Because at the same time you're playing with the audience's sensibility again of what's real and what's not. So if you're balancing an actual field that they've spent time to create, and convince the people, the audience, of the look and the feel of the film, it allows you then to move into more fantasy and surreal elements that little bit easier, and hopefully you can carry the audience with you. So it's a good balance.
It's quite interesting the way certain directors work. Christopher Nolan's quite an interesting character. I think when things are real, actors relate to them differently. Now, actors, are paid to imagine. So you have films like Avatar where they're just in a green environment and they've got to pretend to act. But I think you get a better level of reaction and acting when there's something physical there. So I know Christopher Nolan, I think in Batman, they hung the Batmobile from a helicopter and flew it through Toronto or New York to get those scenes. Sometimes it's cheaper to do things like that, but it looks real because it is real. There is, a cornfield, and there's a automated combine harvester going through the field, and so the actor's got something to play against, and the audience pick up on the believability of it, and it seems more real if there's a physical object there. It's one less thing that the audience has to battle with. You just kind of go, oh yeah, there's the Batmobile flying around Gotham City, because it is there. So yeah, I think it just brings a realism to it, and sometimes it is just a cheaper thing to do, rather than have 50 people or 100 people working on various shots of tracking it, compositing it, grading it. You're just going to go, it's all there in one.
It seems that film productions are leaving Hollywood, since production costs are increasing, as is the level of international competition.
I think there is that kind of inevitability. It's budgets for film seem quite skewed, often away from VFX. So there'll be, The Life of Pi is a classic example for which Rhythm and Hughes, the company that produced all the VFX, including all the tiger and all the animation, were at the point of going bankrupt from it, because the budget for it, there were so many VFX shots to be done, and the whole film without the VFX is pointless. You couldn't do that film without the VFX, yet they got paid very little money, they had very little recognition for that, whereas somebody like the actor or whatever, not necessarily for that film, but the actor will normally have quite a large percentage of the budget, whereas VFX seems to be a lot of work for a little amount of money. And then there is the economics of the world. Sometimes it's cheaper to get work done in other countries. So, you know, America and Hollywood is very expensive to get something done. Canada and Toronto is a lot cheaper than there's places like China and India and whatever. It's easier and cheaper to get the work done up there. So you'll find a lot of VFX houses and now have moved to all these areas. Indonesia, India, Canada has always been really good for kind of animation and VFX. Just because it's cheaper, and then when those places get more expensive, they'll kind of move to the next kind of cheapest. So yeah, it's really difficult because the expectations and the quality has got to be so high, and yet the budgets never really kind of reflect the amount of work that the VFX have got to be seen to be doing.
Nowadays, some people say that the post-production industry has very few barriers to entry, but there are always shrinking budgets, tight timelines to achieve, and these inevitably put pressure on pricing.
The barrier is lowering because of the technology that you need to be able to do it. It's becoming more widespread. I've got a 6-year-old boy who they do chroma keying at school. To live chroma keying at school, so he's introduced to that. He's introduced to video editing and video effects at 6 years old, which for me and my generation, for what I was doing, I was introduced so much later. So if the technology is there at almost a domestic level, then people are going to do it, and people are going to see what's achievable. And I mean, the film houses and effects places that are creating the work are always going to obviously have a high level of production in themselves, and always kind of set the technology that they use at a high level and demand larger budgets because of the equipment that they use. But it might be a case that for certain films, for certain projects, then they get away with cheap production and lower quality. But it's all about democratizing film, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think if it becomes elitist, if any art form becomes elitist, then it becomes tired and it dies. So by democratizing something, you're going to get not so good work, but also you're going to get people who come through that they're going to do wonderful things. They're going to do things that other people just wouldn't think would be achievable. The more people that are going into the industry means that there's more talent coming into the industry. I mean, there's always going to be people who kind of aren't very good at what they're doing as well, but hopefully that gets better.